What's Treason Between Friends? By Andrew Bugenis. Read by Bryan Patrick Stoyle. Cassidy stood stock still, not daring to move, while Zinka scanned the room. In front of a human, Cass could dance a jig while wearing the stealth field generator, and the only giveaway would be the out-of-tempo staccato of 2 left feet. Theoretically, it was perfect. But the thing about state secrets that other species aren't supposed to know about is that there's no way to test in a lab if a Gendeer's superior eyesight could detect the stealth field. And that left field tests. Field test, of course, made it sound like a more controlled situation than it was. What had happened in reality was that a transmission came in for Zinka that Cass hadn't been able to immediately decode, and then he left his quarters with speed. She didn't need to decode the message itself to know what it said. If the encryption was so new that she couldn't crack it, and for Zinka to leave immediately, meant that their friendly rivalry had come to an end. The Gendeer had, somehow, found out about the stealth field technology, and now Zinka was coming for it. The timing of that message was, of course, either unlucky or fortuitous, but either way was suspicious. Just this morning, Cass had received a similar, new encryption, highest security message from the Terran Intelligence Agency, informing her that the opportunity had come to get humanity's own holy grail, blueprints for the subspace jump technology that had allowed the Gendeeri Stellar Economic Union to keep its stranglehold on commerce in known space. Cassidy held her breath, waiting for her opportunity. Though the Gendeer had famously acute eyesight, their hearing and smell were pretty terrible. Still, no need to give him a chance to hear her exhale or to smell the onion on her breath from lunch. Finally, Zin stopped scanning the room and made for her desk to start searching it. From near her bed, she carefully hugged the wall until she was able to slip out the door that was still open and into the hallway. There was no worry of Zinka getting his paws on a working prototype. Cass had the only one in the station, possibly in the whole sector that the station administered. Plans, however, resided on her workstation. She'd started a full white noise crash rewrite of the workstation's drives, but she knew that any master spy, and Zinka was, without a doubt, one of the 2 most masterful spies she knew, the other being herself, could salvage data from a drive that hadn't fully wiped itself yet, given enough time to work. It was almost a sure thing that she'd just lost one of Earth's biggest secrets. All she could do was make use of the time she'd bought and steal back a different secret that would make this all worth it. Zinka's quarters and her own were right around the corner from each other, so Cass didn't bother disabling her stealth field. It could stay on indefinitely, theoretically. So the only thing she had to worry about was some pedestrian not seeing her and getting bowled over by, subjectively, nothing. She kept to the walls and hacked her way into Zinka's suite with ease, only switching off the belt-mounted device once the door was closed behind her. While humans preferred to utilize workstations with large drives for data storage, Gendeer preferred stations that were mere processing and display, with files kept on external chips. They'd carry commonly used chips around with them. When Zinka had entered her room, he'd been wearing a decorative neckpiece with a bunch of chips stashed into it. The chip and display school of thought was hell on physical space requirements. Entire cavernous buildings were dedicated to data storage, and their equivalent of the Postal Service was one of their biggest industries. But when it came time to find a specific chip, it provided its own layer of obscurity. Cass couldn't just copy Zinka's drive to her own personal storage and be done with it. Still, it was organized. She spent time combing through the literal folders before realizing that JSEU's biggest secrets probably wouldn't be on a well-filed chip in the most logical, easy-to-find place. If it was instead intentionally misfiled or mislabeled, she'd never find it. She considered that Zinn might have been carrying it around on his neckpiece, but found that line of thought both unlikely and unhelpful. Think! While at the moment they were trying to steal secrets from each other, Cassidy and Zinka were nonetheless friends. They'd worked together on assignments before and generally enjoyed each other's company, if at that arm's reach distance that people in their profession often kept to. She didn't like how dirty it made her feel, but she'd wrestle with the guilt later. For now, where would he keep a chip with data about subspace jump monopoly? She took a deep breath and forced herself to stand back and scan the room methodically. Stacks of data chips, already ruled out. Kitchenette? No. Too easy to lose or break something with how haphazardly he threw his dishes around. So glad we're not roommates. She went to his living area and took stock of what was there, trying not to recall the times they'd conversed, spoken conversations over light drinks, trying to tease unimportant secrets out of each other, while respecting the big ones. She considered the couch. If nothing else looked promising, she could check the cushions like she was looking for loose change. His model collection, so fastidious compared to the kitchen, Wait. No. Cassidy went to the long, all-glass cabinet that acted as a wall bisecting the living area, in which was held models of different ships. Plenty of Gendir vessels, of course, but a smattering of ships from other species, particularly individual famous vessels. Cass herself had gifted him a model of the TIV Vostok, the vessel that had scouted behind Shawik lines, discovered a weakness in their supply lines, and led to humanity's victory in their first and only interstellar war. Among the other vessels, centered in the whole display, and new since the last time Cass had been there, was a model of a Hrzep-class jump ferry. The JSEU kept careful guard over subspace tech, so nobody else could build jump ferries, and thus were the only company capable of moving people and cargo around the greater galactic community, effectively making the Gendir species as a whole the economic leaders of civilization. Cass took the jump ferry out of the cabinet and examined it. A large, rounded-off hexagon, twice as long as it was wide, with infrastructure for running the vessel, quarters, engines, bridge, all the necessities, in the back, and fully open in the front. Cargo barges were attached to the outside like lampreys, and the gantries inside were covered in greeblies suggesting countless smaller vessels ready for a ride across space. She removed a barge tentatively to check if it contained a chip within it. What she found instead was a small metal contact, not a functional part of the physical connector, not magnetic, electrical. She checked the other barges, all with connectors. She peered close at the inside and found traces of wiring. Either the entire jump ferry was an integrated data chip hiding the secrets of economic monopoly, or it lit up. Whichever it was, she was out of time. Her implant softly pinged that Zinka had left her quarters and would be here in a minute, and she wouldn't even have time to find its plug. If it had one, stupid. It probably just lights up and makes that damn jump noise. And browse its files. Cass re-enabled her stealth field. It struggled with the model in her hand, but as she held it close to her torso, it was able to cloak that, too. She stepped out, closing and locking the door behind her, and slid away as fast as she dared toward the Terran consulate. She spared a glance behind her and saw Zinka round the corner. she refocused forward, dodged pedestrians who didn't know she was there, and tried to just put as much distance as she could between herself and the Gendir spy. She could see in her mind's eye Zinka noticing the missing jump fairy, and the look on his face at knowing his friend had betrayed him, consoled only by the fact that he'd also betrayed his friend. If photons were interacting with Cass right then, she would have been able to see the same look by glancing in a mirror. With 2 fewer eyes and less fur, of course. She made it to a thoroughfare busy enough that remaining invisible would become a liability, and ducked into a comm booth. There, she disabled her stealth field and rigged the belt up around the jump fairy model. When she re-enabled it, it cloaked the ship without issue, and if she held it far enough away from her, it wouldn't try to cloak her as well. She exited the booth, trying to walk as normally as possible while holding something invisible away from one's body. Which is to say, she didn't quite succeed. But most citizens didn't know human body language well enough, and frankly weren't paying enough attention to know that anything was off. Certainly, Cassidy was the only one who bothered to notice her own hand flickering in and out of existence, and she sorely wished she hadn't. The rest of the flight from the station was a blur. Once at the consulate, her credentials got her on the next earthbound ship with no fuss. It just missed the interval on a jump ferry headed to the human homeworld, and had to wait 2 more intervals to take a ferry to Trappist, where a ferry on the next interval would head to Earth. The massive, galaxy-wide Gendiri Universal Interval System meant every single subspace jump happened at exact synchronized times, roughly 6 hours apart from each other, and ignored the solar clocks of almost every colony in the galaxy, aside from their homeworld of Gendarin. But it did make computing travel times with connecting flights a breeze. And besides, Zinka probably expected her to be on the direct-to-Earth flight, not taking a detour, which likely helped explain why no alarm was raised while she waited nervously. Finally, 19 hours after betraying her friend, she looked forward out of her ship, past the hundreds of other ships attached to gantries in front of her, through the open front hexagon of the full-scale Hijrep-class jump ferry she'd ridden, and saw the blue marble of humanity's cradle. A year later, humanity was attacked. In the intervening time, Terran military and intelligence agencies had crunched the data that was, in fact, in the jump ship model. The tech turned out to be easy to replicate. But of course, humanity needed to put their own spin on it. Exotic alloys were switched out for materials more common on Earth, making them cheaper to produce, and emissions created a different profile than JSEU drives, but nothing was thought of it. Headway was being made on making it work on smaller ships, too. First, the big dreadnoughts, then large battleships, then mid-weight cruisers. At first, jumps were always done during intervals. A human ship appearing in civilized space at the wrong time would arouse suspicion. But when going to, say, a secret shipyard and science facility being constructed in deep space, well, ships could come and go all day long. And the question wasn't if anyone would find out, it was when it'd be revealed that humanity could operate jump ferries, and more importantly, license out smaller drives to whoever was willing to cough up the currency. Cassidy was at Alpha Point, helping set up offices. She had been admonished for her presumed loss of stealth field technology, but her acquisition of subspace jump tech more than made up for it. Still, her promotion to office work seemed like quite the opposite to Cass, and she longed for field work again. The attack came out of nowhere. The TSV Marianus arrived in system, checked in, then immediately blew up. Then beams of energy lanced out and split another vessel. This one, a military patrol boat, clear in half. Before they knew it, the defenders of the half-completed installations at Alpha Point were in a fight for their lives, a losing fight, against spindly black and red ships that tore them to shreds. Maybe it was a fleet of the Gendiri police fleet, arrived to punish humanity for stealing their tech. Maybe someone else found out and was jealous. But then how would they have gotten here without a jump ferry of their own? But the forms were unfamiliar, and the capabilities beyond known science. Maybe it was a new species. Whatever it was, Earth needed to know, and a pack of ships made a break for the jump point. The battleship was destroyed, sliced up like a hot stick of butter. Cruisers fell, frigates popped, and science ships melted away. In the end, a single cruiser led a ragged flotilla, creating a cluster of subspace rifts away from Alpha Point and back to Earth. But the unknowns followed. Cassidy could only watch as the combined might of the Terran military and any other armed vessels humanity had in the system fought for their survival. They held the unknowns to a standstill and then, inexorably, began to lose ground. Non-human ships fled the system, gathering at the jump point. The one jump ferry in the system attempted to accommodate them all, stuffing itself to the gills. The next interval was hours away. Navigation lockouts meant it was physically unable to jump until then, but it gave it time to take in as many ships as possible. As crews worked furiously, a subspace rift opened nearby. Crews of every species held their breath in terror, waiting for more unknowns to pour through and take out their rallying point to ensure nobody would leave the system. But the rift closed again, with nothing emerging. The human fighters were getting pushed back, their flotsam adding to the orbital detritus that had accompanied humanity's ascent to the stars. Ursa Station, one of the many terminus stations at the end of the space elevators needed to economically escape Earth's gravity well, was shredded, and the tethers started to slowly whip to the side, foretelling unimaginable damage on the ground. Caught between an ever-advancing rock and the hard place they called home, beleaguered defenders noticed new contacts behind the unknown fleet. They despaired. Surely this was reinforcements in a final push to break their spirit. The new contacts opened fire. And caught unawares, a dreadnought in the unknown fleet erupted into a fireball. Having dropped their stealth fields, the Gendiri police fleet forces opened fire and turned the tide of the battle. Cassidy shuffled through reports of the talks that had taken place after the engagement. It wasn't necessarily in her job description, but she had enough pull to be kept in the loop, and she wanted to see what had resulted from her actions, and those of Zinka, when he had taken the stealth field tech that ended up coming to humanity's rescue. A hold had been placed on all human subspace jumps, not under threat of force, though the human fleet was weakened and would have a hard time fighting back for a time, but under the revelation that among the new emissions that humanity's re-engineering had created was mu radiation, which acted as a sort of beacon for what the Gendiri referred to as the Destroyers. Drawn by concentrations of mu radiation, the Destroyers acted as some sort of cosmic, unknown force that inhibited interstellar travel. Only by using the rare alloys prescribed in the original blueprints could the emissions be kept to a low background level, and by using the intervals, mu radiation emissions were kept to galaxy-wide distributed bursts, rather than concentrations as had happened at Alpha Point and Earth. Armed with the ability to detect mu radiation, human scientists leapt at the problem of eliminating mu radiation entirely. Meanwhile, the human innovation of smaller packaging was revolutionary. Not to be released out to the public until that mu radiation problem had been solved. But with that genie out of the bottle, the combined civilizations of the galaxy clamored for an end to JSEU's stranglehold on interstellar travel. Terran interests were the first to come out with their own jump ferries, utilizing original spec subspace drives and operating on the interval. But it wasn't long until other politico-economic blocs christened their own. Of course, just as the human re-engineering of Gendir technology came with drawbacks, it seemed only fair that the reverse would also be true. "What a surprise to meet you here," Cassidy signed, indicating sarcastic punctuation at the end. Here was in the middle of a hallway, traffic bustling past, at a point that, coincidentally, was equidistant from her own quarters and that of her counterpart. "Imagine that," Zinka signed back, having picked up Cass's penchant for verbal irony. Though verbal wasn't quite the right word anymore. A different station, a few years later, and not quite around the corner from each other anymore. But in between desk stints at the consulate, Cass occasionally got to engage in some rare instances of field work. It made her all nostalgic at times, especially when she got a top-secret tip that more Gendir technology was available to steal. And especially when Zinka seemed to have gotten a similar message. "Personal scale shielding?" Cassidy asked. Zinka nodded. "Energy weapon breakthrough?" Cass nodded back casually and held up a chip. "What say we work together this time?" "I'd appreciate not committing shiploads of naval officers to deafness from poorly adapted tech again," Zinka agreed, flashing a chip of his own from his neckpiece. "And maybe we can avoid summoning a cosmic horror again." "What, worse than humanity?" Cass mock gasped and lightly punched Zinka in the shoulder. The two friends joined hands and set off to commit mutual treason for the betterment of both their species. This has been What's Treason Between Friends? Written by Andrew Bugenis. Read by Bryan Patrick Stoyle. The Destroyers will return in How We Stop the Destroyers, available now wherever audiobooks are sold. Thank you for listening.